She was bigger than most nations' pride, louder than thunder and stronger than reason, yet history barely remembers her name. While the world recalls the titans of war, the Iowa, the Enterprise, the bloody beaches of Tarawa and Normandy, there existed a steel leviathan that shaped the war without ever stealing the spotlight, a warship that stood in the shadow of politics, doctrine, and the titanic egos of admirals who refused to admit she mattered. This is not a story of glory. It's a story of ignorance, of bureaucratic blindness, and of a ship whose power was so profound, it scared the very institution that built her. And yet, her crew never stopped showing up. This is the story of the most underrated American battleship of World War II. A ship that fought harder than many, but was remembered by few. 1941. A design meant for obsolescence. Before she ever touched water, she was already controversial. The naval architects called her beautiful. The strategists called her unnecessary. The bureaucrats called her expensive. And the battleship establishment didn't know where to put her. When Congress approved her design in 1936, it was already under pressure from two opposing forces: the looming threat of global war and the louder internal threat of naval doctrine frozen in time. Battleships had ruled the waves for over half a century, but something new was on the horizon: the aircraft carrier. Yet, the United States Navy, particularly its older admirals, remained obsessed with dreadnought power. Ton for ton, gun for gun. They wanted ships that could slug it out in a duel 20 miles away. The kind of war that would resemble Jutland or Tsushima. But the world had changed, even if the doctrine had not. And into that fading twilight walked a ship with the firepower of a thunder god. And no war to fight it in. Her name was USS Indiana, BB-58. But to most of the Navy, she was simply unimportant. Born for a war that wanted someone else laid down in 1940 at Newport News Shipbuilding, Indiana was the third vessel of the South Dakota class, the most advanced American battleships that no one seemed eager to deploy. With a displacement of over 44,000 tons fully loaded, she carried 9 16-inch 45 caliber Mark VI naval guns, capable of firing a 2,700-pound armor-piercing shell over 23 miles. Her armor was formidable: 12 inches of belt armor, turrets protected by 18 inches of hardened steel. Beneath her decks, her entire structure was designed to withstand punishment. And yet, she was too late to be a decisive player in the age of dreadnoughts, and too early to be fully adapted to the rapidly evolving carrier-based warfare. The Atlantic already had its heroes. The Pacific already had its stars. Indiana? She became the reluctant support fire, the side actor to greater headlines. Her real value, as it turned out, could never be shown in headlines. Only in consistency, in endurance, in survival against staggering odds, again and again. Shoved into the shadows by strategy unlike her sister ship, the South Dakota, which saw heavy action early against Japanese battleships, USS Indiana was sent elsewhere, to escort carriers, to screen larger task forces, to support invasions from a respectable distance. Rarely glamorous, always critical. She was present at the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, the Philippines, and eventually, the bitter final march, Okinawa. But at every step, she was outshone, not by performance, but by perception. She shelled islands, protected carriers, shot down aircraft, supported landings, neutralized shore batteries, and often did so without complaint, spotlight, or recognition. In short, she did her job too well. So well, no one noticed. Her logbooks read like a soldier's journal who did everything asked, but whose name ended up second to last on a promotion list: reliable, durable, and utterly ignored by the mythology of the war. A ship without a legend, but not without a soul. War records show Indiana as part of some of the most intense pre-landing bombardments in WW2, raining fire on Japanese-held islands with terrifying precision. At Kwajalein, she shelled Japanese defenses for 72 hours straight. At Saipan, She poured months of artillery into entrenched caves and bunkers. In 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, she served tirelessly within the screen that repelled what Japan hoped would be their decisive strike, only for the U.S. fleet to shoot down over 600 Japanese aircraft in a single day. Indiana's guns were among the ones firing, but there was no press footage, no hero photo, no admiral standing on her bridge making speeches, only the crew and the sound of the guns. She never ran, she never faltered, and she never glorified herself. And for those reasons, she was never lionized in the way other ships were. Her actions simply didn't make drama. They made results. Carrier doctrine would bury her as World War II entered its Pacific climax. The U.S. Navy had fully committed to one idea. The future was in air power. Air groups became equal to divisions. Carriers became flagships. And the great ships of steel, as monstrous and powerful as they were, became bodyguards, muscle to protect the real stars of the show. Indiana fought in every amphibious campaign from 1943 to 1945, but at those battles, historians photograph planes, not shells. She shelled Tinian, bombarded Guam, leveled artillery at Peleliu, and helped silence the guns of Iwo Jima. But the headlines went to the Marines and Corsair pilots, not the warships that kept them safe. Worse, when she collided with USS Washington in February 1944, the incident almost overshadowed her previous service. The collision was not fatal, but the implication was loud. She was now a liability, except she wasn't. That same year, she would go on to participate in 3 Pacific offensives, suffer heavy weather, survive kamikaze attacks, and deliver naval gunfire so devastating that Japanese broadcasts called it the Iron Rain of the West. It wasn't her weakness that hurt her legacy. It was her strength. Indiana never lost a major engagement. She was never sunk, seriously damaged, or placed out of action despite taking part in more operations than many of the more famous ships combined. She claimed multiple aircraft kills with her 5-inch guns, supported amphibious troops across over a dozen battlefronts, and remained operational through the most punishing campaigns of the war. She held formation when other ships broke off. She maintained fire control even when visibility was zero. She pumped thousands of rounds into Japanese strongholds that had pinned entire divisions for weeks. But she never had the glamour of a duel, never torpedoed a cruiser, never received that one perfect photo. She never got a moment to be cinematic. In the history business, that's enough to erase you. The ship that proved guns still mattered in 1945 during the invasion of Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. Indiana came into her own, facing hardened Japanese resistance, cave fortifications, and suicidal air attacks. She became part of the naval line that delivered 24-hour bombardment on Japanese positions while shielding escort carriers from kamikazes. At one point, she began firing her main battery once every 38 seconds continuously for over 5 hours, a record for consistency with the 16-inch naval gun class. She melted barrels, overheated her hoists, broke steel recoil gears under the strain. Still, she fired. Her ship's log described her state afterward as fatigued but effective. One officer would later write, "You'd think she would fall apart from how hard we pushed her." But Indiana never staggered. She was built to brawl even if no one asked her to lead. Her greatest victory was survival. When the war ended, and the great ships of battle came limping back, riddled, scarred, burned, Indiana returned almost pristine. Tired? Yes. Weathered? Certainly. But still sharp. Still ready. She had fired more rounds than almost any other battleship in her class. She had steamed further, stayed out longer, taken part in more operational days. Yet when the rolls of glory were called, Indiana's name came silently. No movie, no parade, just a signature on deactivation papers, and a crew that quietly saluted the flag they had fought for. And then, she was gone by September 1947. Only 2 years after the end of the war she had helped win. USS Indiana was decommissioned. No presidential speech marked her retirement. No senator from her namesake state argued for preserving her as a museum. She was sold for scrap. Her bell now sits silently at Indiana University. Her name, unlike her steel, could not be melted down, but it could be buried. And it was, beneath bigger stories, beneath bigger ships, beneath bigger lies told by organizations that never wanted to admit that a gunship, a relic of the past, had saved the future. She should have been remembered as revolutionary. Instead, she was reduced to redundancy. No post-war doctrine ever mentioned Indiana by name. No tactical textbook studied her fire support record. No Pentagon lesson plan used her logs as a blueprint for precision artillery coordination against island fortifications, not because she wasn't effective, not because she didn't matter, but because she didn't fit the post-war carrier-first narrative, and that's what made her dangerous to naval memory. Ending Part 1. In the chapters of naval warfare, some ships are born into glory, some are pushed into it, and others, like Indiana, drag glory behind them for thousands of miles, only to be shrugged off at the dock when it ends. But ask the Marines at Tinian. Ask the sailors who watched her 16-inch guns speak. Ask the pilots who survived kamikaze flak dances because she stood between the carriers. Ask them if Indiana was just another battleship. They won't say she was the most famous, but they might just tell you she was the one they wanted nearby when hell broke loose. There's a quiet violence to a ship like Indiana, not in rage, not in chaos, but in purpose, the kind that rips mountains apart with patient mathematical fury. Her war was not made of headlines. It was made of schedules, barrages, rotations, coordinates scribbled over a plotting table, and the echo of 16-inch guns pulverizing beachheads. No one wrote war ballads about her, but American forces followed behind her fire like apostles chasing a path through the jungle. Indiana never promised glory. She promised coverage. She promised steel certainty when all else was uncertain. Target: the Marshall Islands, 1944. The world remembers Tarawa, the bloody landing, the images of men being mowed down in the surf. But behind Tarawa, behind the blackened wrecks and bullet-riddled Higgins boats, stood artillery support that had done its job so thoroughly that even the Japanese recognized its impact. One of those platforms was Indiana. In early 1944, she was shifted to Task Force 58, where her job became clear: prepare the battlefield and punish anyone who resisted. At Kwajalein and Majuro, she fired ceaselessly, pounding gun placements, radio towers, ammunition stores, and bunkers deep into the volcanic soil. For many Marines, her incoming fire became a motif of comfort, something they could feel in their chest before they ever heard her name whispered on a radio. A forward observer later recalled, Indiana's fire sounded different. It punched the island in waves. We knew she was there, and every time she roared, we got closer to the objective. Mastery through monotony. Most people think of warships in terms of battles. Hollywood wants duels, last stands, titanic clashes. But Indiana showed what a battleship could be when used strategically, not as a leading blade, but as an unstoppable sledgehammer. By mid-1944, she had become one of the Navy's most reliable fire support vessels, consistently operating at near maximum output with astonishing endurance. While newer ships rotated back for reassignment, Indiana stayed in theater. Her crew hardened to the sun, the salt, and the endless cycles of fire missions, and yet no other ship got less camera time, less newsprint, less celebration. There's no statue of Indiana, no iconic silhouette like the Missouri, just a record of targets neutralized and lives saved. Collision course with misfortune. The USS Washington incident on February 1, 1944. Indiana suffered the kind of incident that would haunt her legacy, even though she survived it with the efficiency that defined her career. While maneuvering for refueling among a tight group of American ships, she collided with USS Washington, another fast battleship operating in the task group. Damage was significant. Her stern was crushed, multiple compartments flooded. Washington was repaired and returned to duty. Indiana was mocked by whispers. She became the battleship that couldn't see, as if one miscalculation dismissed all her prior service. And even that incident wasn't her fault. Poor visibility, unclear maneuvering orders, and miscommunication between bridge navigators caused the accident. But neither Indiana nor her crew were found at fault in official review. Still, the image stuck. In a Navy where attention followed glory, and glory followed image, Indiana's scars became her story instead of her service. She went into repair. She came out stronger than ever, but now fighting a quiet war not only against Japan, but against irrelevance. Saipan, Guam, Tinian. The triple assault. As the U.S. ramped up its advance through the Mariana Islands, Indiana returned to her fire missions. Not glamorous, not historic, just mission-critical. Her shelling of Saipan created breach points in rock formations that had stymied infantry. At Guam, she suppressed Japanese batteries positioned behind cliff faces with leaflet-layer precision, throwing 16-inch rounds within a 30-yard margin. At Tinian, the forward observers radioed just 4 words back to Fleet Command after a full 90-minute barrage from Indiana's main guns. Island surface is flat. That wasn't poetic exaggeration. That was mathematics, the kind that naval war planners love, but journalists ignore. Indiana didn't just soften beaches. She deleted topography. A commander. Without a campaign, one of the reasons Indiana never reached the heights of reverence like the Iowa or Missouri is simple. She never had her own battle. Missouri got the surrender ceremony. South Dakota got the last man standing story at Santa Cruz at Iowa. Got FDR on board. Indiana? She assisted in dozens of landings, shelled cities, fortresses, and battalions. And perhaps that's the problem. She was too good at fitting in, too selfless to stand out. Her commanding officers likewise were of the efficient, professional, unpolitical type. Vice Admiral Willis Lee, when asked about Indiana's performance in the Marianas, simply said, "She performs as constructed. That's all the compliment a warship needs." Perhaps that was true, but maybe that was exactly why no one told her story. The kamikaze problem. Indiana answers. By late 1944, Japanese strategy had changed. Facing a dominant U.S. Navy, Japan returned to suicidal attrition. The kamikaze raids, terrifying, crude, effective. Other ships buckled under the shock of men flying bomb-laden planes into steel hulls. Carrier decks caught fire. Troop ships lost steering. Cruisers buckled under payloads. But one class of ship quickly gained a reputation as the best place to be when the storm came: the South Dakotas. And within that class, Indiana became legendary for her ability to absorb and repel air attacks. Between late 1944 and 1945, Indiana helped defend dozens of Navy ships from suicide attacks, often placing herself between dive bombing vectors and the carriers. Her task group rarely lost a ship when Indiana was in the firing line. Her 5-inch dual-purpose shells, backed by newer fire control computers combined with 40mm and 20mm Bofors batteries, turned her into an anti-aircraft fortress. A radio man aboard the USS Belleau Wood later said, "Standing next to Indiana during a kamikaze wave felt like hiding behind a thunderstorm. She made so much noise, death forgot where we were. How do you give medals for a situation where nothing got hit because everything got shot down? You don't. You toss it into the statistics pile. Just another patrol, another strike group rotation, and when you overlook moments like that, you forget everything Indiana was." Marching toward the Bloodlands, Iwo Jima and Okinawa in February 1945, the U.S. launched its climactic push through Japan's most fortified islands, one that would define hell on earth for an entire generation. Iwo Jima. Okinawa. These weren't just battles. They were meat grinders, churning lives into tactical perseverance, and anchored offshore, again, uncelebrated, again indispensable, was USS Indiana at Iwo Jima. She coordinated for 7 days with Marines, synchronizing shelling with troop movement, demolishing pillboxes in real time, and clearing fallback paths through volcanic stone. Then came Okinawa. By April 1945, Indiana had become a kind of myth already, not for her brilliance, but for her consistency. She survived over 30 air raids, engaged enemy gunnery over 40 times, and shelled everything from command posts to radar stations. And she never broke, a middling ship in name. But among crew and command, she had become the watchdog of Task Group 58. Inside the hull, her crew tells the truth. It's easy to talk about big guns, but ships aren't steel. They're souls, driven by men whose stories rarely enter official records. Sailors aboard BB-58 wrote the following in a handwritten shipboard newsletter the week before Japan's surrender. "She takes hell like a steel mule and throws it back at double. We ain't got polish. We got power. Ask anybody who's had her shadow." Gunner's mate, second-class Harvey Solzman, recalled, "The battles were quiet on her deck. That's the thing. After the first few salute salvos, you stop flinching. The guns just become part of you, like breathing." To this day, Indiana veterans carry a strange badge. They fought in more operations than most, but got less historical mention than nearly all. Ask them about it, though, and most just smile. Because USS Indiana didn't serve to be remembered. She served to be reliable. A life measured in deadlines, not decorations. Her logbooks weren't stories. They were spreadsheets of devastation. Over 250 days in combat, more than 6 major amphibious campaigns supported 0 fatal kamikaze hits. Only battle damage. Collision with a U.S. ship. Not the enemy fired over 916-inch shells, participated in every island conquest from Kwajalein to Okinawa. And when surrender came in August, Indiana was ready for one more role: occupation duty. She delivered troops to Japan, ferried supplies and food, assisted in rebuilding. The final act of any great battleship, making peace possible with the same engines that powered destruction. Then came silence. In September 1947, USS Indiana was decommissioned. She was placed into the reserve fleet, and from that moment forward, her name began slipping from memory. End of Part 2. The Navy that had relied on her discipline never bothered to remember her distinction. But the pilots she protected, the Marines she cleared the way for, and the sailors who slept better under her guns, they remember. She never got her movie, never got her monument, one crewman once said. But she got us home. That's a hell of a legacy for a ship still called underrated. The war was over, flags waved, bands played, medals glittered, and the battleship once tasked with battering the walls of Japan, the steel giant that had fired more rounds than almost any ship in her class, that never flinched in the face of the Pacific storm, sailed home. But there was no welcome. There was no fanfare. Just silence. USS Indiana, the quiet hammer of the Pacific, returned to a nation drunk on victory but narrow in memory. Her war was won, but her real battle was just beginning. A battle not against torpedoes or kamikazes, but against irrelevance. Post-war doctrine, a new war against the past. The United States Navy in 1945 stood at a crossroads. On one side, tradition. On the other, the blinding light of a new military age. Radar had matured, air power had triumphed, and the carrier, once viewed as a fragile experiment, now stood as the centerpiece of naval dominance. Battleships? To many they were viewed as obsolete relics, too slow, too needy, and too vulnerable in the atomic era. It didn't matter that Indiana never failed a mission. It didn't matter that she had outlasted combat aircraft programs whose names were already forgotten. What mattered was optics. Carriers looked like the future. Battleships? The past. Indiana, like so many of her steel cousins, was shelved, not because she was broken, but because she no longer fit the narrative. Her record didn't matter. Her statistics didn't fit. And the truth? That was the most dangerous thing of all. Ships can't complain. So she was ignored. No battleship crew protested. There were no strikes. No letters. No rebellions. They were sailors, bridge officers, gunners, trained to serve, not argue. They packed their gear, folded the flags, closed the hatches, and walked away. In the months that followed, Indiana was moved to the reserve fleet, a floating ghost, maintained in stasis, but without purpose. Steel faded, paint peeled, and with time, even the memory of her role began eroding. Unlike USS North Carolina, preserved as a floating museum, unlike USS Missouri, immortalized by VJ Day, Indiana simply sat, rusting quietly, the only ship in her class without a narrative the public remembered. And how could they? She didn't have a heroic duel. She didn't carry a president. She didn't sink the Yamato. Her greatest sin was that she succeeded without glory, the danger of a ship, without a story-shape reality. The U.S. Navy, in an effort to unify around a new strategic doctrine centered around air dominance, needed to celebrate specific symbols. The Iowa class became the proud survivors, the innovators, the fast battleships with streamlined flair. The South Dakotas, despite battle records that rival and often exceed Iowa-class achievements, were quietly written down as support ships, and Indiana's name was the first to vanish. No books, no documentaries, no grand historians, choosing her as a central subject wherever her name sat in archives. It was almost always footnoted: escorted carriers, fired in support, no major damage sustained. That summary? It omits 2 years of frontline operations, dozens of successful bombardments, and a ship whose crew regularly slept inside a thunderstorm of their own making. How do you forget that? Simple. You convince yourself it didn't matter. Testimonials from the silenced in 1963. Long after Indiana had been sold for scrap, a naval archivist interviewed surviving sailors from BB-58. Of the 10 men spoken to, 7 said the same phrase when asked if they felt their ship had been remembered properly. They never noticed us. And maybe they never wanted to. One gunnery officer, who had served on both the Indiana and later on the Iowa, was quoted, "The only difference was the press crew. Indiana hit targets just as hard, kept formation better, and stood longer under air attack. But we had no big name, no mascot, no PR, we just fought." Indiana's crew never expected a rose parade. They expected fairness, but battleship history, like most military history, is shaped by admirals, not pages from musty logbooks. And if your ship didn't make the poster, you didn't make the curriculum. Steel versus symbolism. The final insult. When the Navy began its 1947 force reductions, dozens of older ships were flagged for decommissioning. Among the battleship candidates, many in the South Dakota class were still battle-ready. Structurally, Indiana required minimal upgrades to serve in the Korean conflict or Cold War Navy as a fire support platform. But she was cut. Not because she was worn out, not because she couldn't operate, but because no one fought for her. The reasoning given? No longer essential within evolving strategic framework. That was the cold bureaucracy's way of saying, she is everything we don't want to remember. And that's exactly why she mattered. USS Indiana lives as a ghost in today's Navy modern. Destroyers carry radar fire control systems that descend directly from 1940s battleship computers' missile. Cruisers offshore today employ land-targeting algorithms that have their roots in gunnery procedures developed aboard ships like Indiana submarine detection routes, the naval combat arcs taught at war colleges. Many were first tested around the screening work Indiana did around the Mariana and Philippine theater. But nowhere, in manuals or lectures, do commanders say, this tactic was first validated on USS Indiana, because the name fell behind. Not because it failed, but because it was too successful to be dramatic. You can't sink what you never acknowledge. Indiana didn't go out in fire. She went out in silence. In 1962, the Navy announced her official strike from the Naval Vessel Register. Less than a year later, her final parts were sold for $418,000 in scrap weight. $500,000 to erase one of the most disciplined, unbroken, loyal warships of the Second World War. Her bell now rings at Bloomington. One of her 16-inch guns rests in a Kansas scrapyard. Most people don't know what ship the gun came from. More than steel, she was a lesson ignored here, is what USS Indiana proved. That precision gunnery, when properly trained and integrated, could rival airstrikes in targeted power. That discipline over drama wins wars, though not the history books. That when battleships are used for survivability, coordination, and suppression, they become force multipliers. That killing glory doesn't mean killing utility. It just makes memory harder to sell. Indiana wasn't obsolete. She was inconvenient. She was the proof that the war wasn't only won from the sky, that for every screaming dive bomber on film, there was a steel broadside delivered silently and effectively from a ship no one televised, that the doctrine of the future ignored the foundation of success the past gave it. Legacy smaller than she deserved. When you look at the legacy of USS Indiana today, you find fragments, a few faded photos, technical schematics buried in shipbuilding records, bell on a campus that most students walk past without reading the plaque, no memorial, no centerpiece tour, not even a dry exhibit in the Naval Heritage Museum. A warship that fought across 6 military operations, supported the greatest push across the Pacific, and never broke under fire. All but erased. That isn't just a mistake, that's a tragedy, and worse, a pattern. A repeatable error in military memory history tends to favor symbols, not systems. The Spitfire gets remembered over radar, the Mustang over logistics, the Missouri over Indiana. Yet ask any operational commander, and they'll tell you the truth. The things that win wars don't always make good movie scenes, but they work. Indiana didn't win headlines, she just won missions, over and over again. And for that sin, her place in public consciousness was quietly retired. End of Part 3. When the steel giants of the Pacific are named, remember this. One ducked glory but faced fire. One erased her own smoke to keep others alive. One never gave less than all, and never asked for a portrait afterwards. That was BB-58. USS Indiana, a ghost in the fleet, a backbone with no face. But ask those who served with her, and they'll tell you she was the ship you wanted behind your back when the world turned red. Time forgets machines faster than men. Steel rusts. Guns fall silent. Logbooks are closed and boxed, sealed away in cold archives where curious hands rarely reach. But some truths are too rooted to fade. And one of them, carved across 2 brutal Pacific years, reads simply SS. Indiana was a warship that fought like hell and asked for nothing. She never wrote headlines. She never dazzled the press, but the path to victory ran through the islands she shelled, the Marines she shielded, and the waves she owned. This final chapter isn't just remaking her memory. It's restoring what should have never been forgotten. USS Indiana, the shadow giant who carried whole campaigns there, are moments buried in Indiana's logbooks that now read like prophecy. Cold, simple lines that belied the chaos surrounding them. Provided fire support for landing forces across southern beach. Intercepted and neutralized 4 aircraft at 1935 hours. Expended 180 rounds of primary battery in suppression of inland defenses. Remained on station 72 consecutive hours while carriers refueled and reorganized. Each entry is a pulse in the body of the war. Each is a note in a symphony of survival played by ships the world now pretends it can't name. Indiana never paused for praise. She led with fire and shielded with silence, and That's exactly what turned her into one of the most feared, yet unsung, weapons the Allies ever created, because she wasn't just built to fight. She was built to last, and in a war where the environment devoured men and machines alike, that meant everything. Marines remember what history often forgets. In 1978, a group of surviving Marines who landed at Saipan held a private reunion in Baltimore. One segment of their event included a tribute not just to fellow ground troops, but to the ships that covered their landings. One veteran of the 2nd Marine Division stood and shared, "When we hit Red Beach at 06:20, machine guns tore us apart. And then the planet shook. Shells the size of Volkswagens came in from the sea. I turned and saw her, USS Indiana, unloading hell. Those 16-inch guns knocked the top off the cliffs in 30 seconds. We didn't breach the island. She cracked it open for us. Someone asked if Indiana had gotten a Navy Cross for that operation. The old man just laughed. No, but me and 312 men with warm meals and lungs full of air. We're living medals." Indiana was the kind of ship that didn't need to be celebrated by admirals, because she'd already been etched into the survival of every Marine she saved. Innovation in action. What she silently proved naval. Historians later acknowledged that Indiana helped validate multiple operational doctrines, including sustained fire suppression, ability to maintain precision shelling for multiple hours without loss of fire control, critical for Saipan, Tinian, Okinawa, to integrated anti-aircraft defense. During kamikaze assaults, Indiana's coordinated AA network ensured overlapping firing arcs with real-time radar adjustments, setting a baseline for Cold War gunnery doctrine. Endurance. Testing of mechanical systems. Indiana operated for campaigns longer than originally designed, showcasing advanced turbine durability and coolant systems that became models for post-war vessel designs. Yet none of these ever carried her name forward. Instead, these tactics were credited to task forces, fleet commands, and theoretical doctrines. Indiana was the working-class proof of strategic genius. The proof no one wanted to admit came from a ship they considered just another battleship. Disassembled, but not defeated in 1963, when USS Indiana was scrapped piece by piece, no ceremony was held. No veterans stood on her deck. No Navy band played songs. No dignitary gave speeches. A ship that had sailed 500,000 nautical miles, withstood typhoons and kamikazes, and delivered fire support in 6 of the most brutal campaigns in naval history, simply vanished. Her steel was sold. Her heart stayed with the men who sailed her. And yet, in corners of museums, in dusty oral histories, and inside footnotes barely read, fragments remain. A radar console, a navigation wheel, a gunnery officer's diary with entries that still smell faintly of cordite and brine. You can delete a ship from the records. You can melt her hull. You can scatter her pieces across scrapyards, but you can't unwrite what she proved. Her sailors never forgot, and neither should we. The forgotten lesson. There is no such thing as routine in warriors. Indiana was called upon for routine fire support. Routine, escort, routine carrier screening. But there's no such thing when the shells are real. No such thing when your radar officer loses 3 friends in a flash on the skydeck. No such thing when a Japanese on 0 slices within 60 feet of your fire control tower and still, you hold the line. Routine becomes the excuse that history uses to ignore what was done over. And over, and over. The truth? Indiana did things routinely that would have earned other ships legends. Why underrated means so much more when we say the most underrated battleship. We don't just mean she was underdecorated. We mean she was actively forgotten, overshadowed, flattened. Beneath slogans. Rewritten by post-war strategy that needed clean narratives and simple heroes. Not contradictions. Not ghosts. A contradiction like Indiana was dangerous to a Navy that had transitioned full speed into the era of jet engines and nuclear subs. She was a reminder that sometimes the best doesn't look the loudest that a ship built, for war might not love it, and a crew trained for destruction might prefer duty done well, with no applause, only silence. Underrated isn't a complaint. It's a truth hidden behind bureaucracy, missed medals, and abandoned hulls. What modern war can still learn from her flash. Forward to today. Modern destroyers dance at high speed across the Pacific. Drones buzz through simulated fire zones, satellites scan for missiles, and stealth blends into the sea. But deep in the core of every naval officer's training is a line that Indiana proved with every wave she broke. There is no replacement for presence. Indiana mattered not because of what she might do, but because of what every fleet commander knew she could do, anytime, without fail. And that truth kept other sailors alive. In an age where flash gets funding and headlines win contracts, Indiana's story pushes back. We gave you the quiet victory, the one that gets no monument. And for that, believe it or not, posterity owes her more than any statue can ever say. Final words. A ship's true legacy, USS Indiana, never asked to be remembered. She just wanted to return from war, with her crew breathing and her guns silent, and she did. Her 16-inch barrels were never fired in vengeance, only in defense. Only to shield the men who ran toward rifle fire. Only to break the rock so Marines didn't have to. Her greatest accomplishments were never singular moments. They were repetitions of excellence few ships ever matched, and in that story, hidden beneath decades of silence, there's a lesson for every generation. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply doesn't fail. And that is enough to win a war. Close the logbook, but keep it open. 80 years after her keel was laid, USS Indiana remains a whisper in documentaries, skipped 100 times by researchers who confuse famous with important. But for your next walk past a ship turret at a museum, your next glance at a naval blueprint, your next moment studying carrier group diagrams from WSUI, look a little deeper. Indiana is there. In every margin, in every footnote, behind every decisive victory, she is silence behind the storm. Steel beneath. Survival, power without vanity. She is what America's quiet warriors always were. Enough, even when unmentioned.